Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. The press says we're in a climate crisis, and they should know because they've been reporting that for about a century. They tell us that we have less than 4 months to save the planet from global warming. June 29th, 2017, 4 years to save the Earth. 2020 is the deadline to avert climate catastrophe, experts claim in chilling commentary. When it comes to climate, timing is everything, Nature commentary said. And now here's another story from 2004. The Pentagon tells Bush climate change will destroy us. Britain will be Siberian in less than 20 years. Britain is plunged into a Siberian climate by 2020. Nuclear conflict, mega droughts, famine, and widespread rioting will erupt across the world. So apparently all of that is going to happen in the next 4 months. And at the same time which Britain is going to become Siberian, it's also going to become Mediterranean, and English gardens are going to look like this. And in 2004, the chief scientist of the UK, David King, said that everybody was going to have to move to Antarctica because the rest of the world was going to be too hot. It's a shame that all those people from Britain are going to have to leave their Mediterranean gardens in their Siberian climate. But it's all worse than it seems. 30 years ago, the UN said that the climate catastrophe was going to occur by the year 2000. June 30th, 1989, grim forecast. A senior environmental official at the United Nations, Noel Brown, says entire nations could be wiped off the face of the earth by rising sea levels if global warming is not reversed by the year 2000. Coastal flooding and crop failures would create an exodus of eco-refugees threatening political chaos, said Brown, the director of the New York office of the UN Environment Program. And here's the same story from the New York Times and PBS in 1986. Earth's climatic crisis examined by NOVA. Picking up where a high school chemistry class might end, NOVA, the public broadcasting science series, offers the non-matriculating viewer an advanced course in worrying. The cause of the concern is all the carbon dioxide that's being pumped into the industrialized and motorized air. I can't remember ever actually seeing industrialized and motorized air. Perhaps the New York Times could help us out with that. And then they say, the hour-long broadcast is called The Climate Crisis, The Greenhouse Effect at 9 tonight on Channel 13. The conclusion, conveyed with great authority by several big league climatologists from government and private research organizations, is terrible. By the year 2000, the atmosphere and weather will grow warmer by several degrees, and life, animal, plant, and human will be threatened. Melting ice caps, flooded cities, droughts in the Corn Belt, and famine. So apparently the world ended 20 years ago, but pretending that it didn't, let's look at how these experts did. This is the graph for drought in the Corn Belt from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Green periods are wet, brown periods are dry, and this is when that NOVA show was presented. As you can see, it's actually been very wet in the Corn Belt since these forecasts of doom were made. In fact, they've had the fewest droughts on record. This is the graph of corn yields in the United States going back to the middle of the 19th century. As you can see, they keep growing to record levels every year. As carbon dioxide has increased, corn yields have increased with them. This is partly because plants grow faster in higher CO2 environments. That's why people who operate commercial greenhouses pump carbon dioxide into the atmosphere inside their greenhouse. Plants love carbon dioxide and they can't grow without it. The report by big league climatologists conveyed with great authority was made back here in 1986, and since then corn yields have nearly doubled. And what about the famine they warned about? This graph from Oxford University shows global deaths by famine for every decade going back to the 1860s. You can see that the current decade is by far the lowest on record, and that deaths from famine have plummeted over the last 50 years. When I was a kid growing up in the 1960s, there were huge numbers of people starving to death in China and India. We don't see that anymore. And in fact, China's had 1,800 major famines since the year 108 BC, which is pretty near a famine a year according to the nation's own official records. In the 2-year-long famine of 1877 and 1878, it's estimated that 9,500,000 persons starved to death. So many millions died in the famines of 1887, 1889, 1911, and 1916 that enumeration was little better than a guess. It's interesting to note that these famine years in China also coincided with heat wave years in the United States and Europe. That tells me that the climate is controlled by something other than carbon dioxide, because carbon dioxide levels were very low back then. So in 1986, big league climatologists told us that we're all going to die from global warming by the year 2000. But 12 years earlier, they had a completely different story. New ice age to begin soon, scientific data shows. They imply that the threat of a new ice age must now stand alongside nuclear war as a likely source of wholesale death and misery for mankind. And in 1976, frequently freakish weather. Some scientists theorize that the freakish weather of recent years is the product of a global cooling trend that began in the 1940s. Advocates of this theory predict that the worldwide temperature drop could usher in a little ice age similar to the one that lasted roughly from 1600 to 1850. A CIA report supporting the global cooling thesis was released last month. It warned that world food supplies could be threatened if the cooling trend continued. The stability of most nations is based on a dependable source of food, but this stability will not be possible under the new climate era, the report said. The politics of food will become the central issue of every government. May 4th, 1976, climatic changes would bring global unrest, CIA report says. Major climatic changes will bring about global unrest of a proportion almost beyond comprehension, heightening the risk of international conflict, according to the CIA report released today. And here is the CIA report. There is a growing consensus among leading climatologists that the world is undergoing a cooling trend. The press tells us that we're not allowed to argue against the consensus of scientists, so the world must be undergoing a cooling trend. And here's one from a leading scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, where I'll be riding my bicycle in a few minutes. The Boston Globe, Thursday, April 16, 1970. Scientist predicts a new ice age by the 21st century. The demands for cooling water will boil dry the entire flow of the rivers and streams of the continental United States. Lodge, speaking at the Institute of Environmental Sciences at the Sheraton in Boston, said 3 factors could prevent these disasters: population control, a less wasteful standard of living, and a major technological breakthrough in the way man consumes the Earth's resources. Scientists were busy thinking up all kinds of technological breakthroughs to stop global cooling. The cooling world. Climatologists are pessimistic that political leaders will take any positive action to compensate for the climatic change or even to allay its effects. They concede that some of the more spectacular solutions proposed, such as melting the Arctic ice cap by covering it with black soot or diverting Arctic rivers, might create problems far greater than those they solve. So 45 years ago, scientists wanted to put soot on the Arctic to stop global cooling, and now they want to put soot in the stratosphere to stop global warming. Scientists were so worried about global cooling in 1972 that 42 top American and European investigators sent a letter to President Nixon warning of a new ice age in about a century. I'm not sure what they were worried about, though, because in 1970 they said that the oceans will be as dead as Lake Erie by the year 1980, and that America will be subject to water rationing by 1974 and food rationing by 1980. So an ice age seems like the least of their problems. I was playing on the soccer team at Arizona State University in 1974, and I remember getting pretty hungry and pretty thirsty a few times. Phoenix had their all-time record heat wave that year in 1974, 18 consecutive days over 110 degrees, and that was right at the peak of the Ice Age scare. The New York Times and scientists were so worried about overpopulation in 1969 that they proposed poisoning food and water being shipped to third world countries. November 25, 1969, a sterility drug in food is hinted. Biologist stresses need to curb population growth. A possibility that the government might have to put sterility drugs in reservoirs and in food shipped to foreign countries to limit human multiplication was envisioned today by a leading crusader on the population problem. I remember this guy very well, and in fact he's still active with climate alarmism. Progressives loved him. And by 1967 it was already too late to stop the famine. Dire famine forecast by 75. So in the 60s, we were all going to freeze to death and die of famine if we didn't poison third world countries' water. But a decade earlier, the problem was global warming. February 18, 1952, polar ice thaw increasing. Glaciers said to be melting. Dr. William S. Carlson, an Arctic expert, said tonight that the polar ice caps were melting at an astonishing and unexplained rate and were threatening to swamp seaports by raising the ocean levels. The glaciers of Norway and Alaska are only half the size they were 50 years ago. Same story in the 1940s. Saturday, May 31st, 1947. Arctic phenomenon. Warming of climate causes concern. The possibility of a prodigious rise in the surface of the ocean with resultant widespread inundation arising from an Arctic climatic phenomenon was discussed yesterday by Dr. Hans Alman, a noted Swedish geophysicist at the University of California Geophysical Institute. He said that temperatures in the Arctic had increased 10 degrees Fahrenheit since 1900, an enormous rise from a scientific standpoint. The Arctic change is so serious that I hope an international agency can speedily be formed to study the conditions on a global basis. He pointed out that whereas in 1910 the navigable season along western Spitsbergen lasted 3 months, it now lasted 8 months. This is the same location where climate warriors trapped in the ice had to be rescued a few weeks ago. And if we go back 80 years ago, it's the same thing, global warming. All the glaciers in eastern Greenland are rapidly melting, declared Professor Hans Alman, Swedish geologist. It may without exaggeration be said that the glaciers, like those in Norway, face the possibility of a catastrophic collapse. And in 1937, a noted Arctic explorer said the temperatures were reported along the Yukon River above 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade. Imagine the mass hysteria if that happened now. And here's a story from the 1920s about some women who tried to drive to the Arctic Ocean. Through Belgium, Holland, Germany, Denmark, Lapland, and Finland, the motor party journeyed to 270 miles north of the Arctic Circle, prepared for freezing weather. To their continued astonishment, the temperature was never less than 90 degrees in the shade. The intention was to reach the Arctic Ocean, but 40 miles of marsh country, i.e. melted permafrost, on the coast prevented this. An average of 210 miles a day was made on the journey, which was arduous in the extreme, and at one time the car had an actual race with death among the forest fires in Sweden over terrible roads. Imagine that, 90-degree temperatures in the Arctic, melted permafrost, and massive forest fires 90 years ago. And here's a story from November 1922 in the Monthly Weather Review. The Arctic seems to be warming up. Reports from fishermen, seal hunters, and explorers who sail the seas about Spitsbergen in the eastern Arctic all point to a radical change in climatic conditions and hitherto unheard of high temperatures in that part of the Earth's surface. Many old landmarks are so changed as to be unrecognizable. Where formerly great masses of ice were found, there are now often moraines, accumulations of earth and stones. At many points where glaciers formerly extended far into the sea, they have entirely disappeared. Last winter, the ocean did not freeze over even on the north coast of Spitsbergen. So there was no ice around Spitsbergen during the winter of 1922, but a few weeks ago climate warriors got trapped there in the middle of summer. And the press was reporting exactly the same story as in 1934. Well, melting icebergs engulf the world, and they had a picture of Manhattan underwater from melting ice. And here's the same picture from Climate Central 85 years later, Manhattan underwater. And they say that in order to stop this, you need to send them money. In 1988, the world's leading climatologist from NASA, Dr. James Hansen, predicted that lower Manhattan would be underwater within 30 years, which would have been last year. So you better send your money off to Climate Central quick. But a savior has arisen to rescue us from all these climate disasters. Bernie Sanders has a $16 trillion climate plan to save us from global warming, and that works out to a bargain of only $100,000 per family. He says that if every family in America simply gives him $100,000, he can end fossil fuel use by the year 2050. I personally like being able to have food, communications, light, heat, and all the other amenities of a modern lifestyle. And it isn't clear to me why I would want to give $100,000 to Bernie to ruin our civilization. And if he can't do it until the year 2050, it'll be too late anyway, because the Washington Post says the world's going to end in less than 12 years. Reality is that people are living better and better. The percentage of the world population living in extreme poverty has plummeted over the last century. And a lot of people used to die in natural disasters around the earth, but now it's very few. Death rates from natural disasters have plummeted over the past century. So what exactly are we giving Bernie Sanders $100,000 of our family's money for? The whole thing is completely insane. Climate alarmists have no idea what they're talking about. They've been wrong over and over and over again. Almost invariably, climate trends have gone the exact opposite of what they predicted. And there's a simple reason for that. Climate is cyclical. These people are ambulance chasers. During periods of time when the Earth is warming, they predict further warming. During periods of time when Earth is cooling, they predict further cooling. And they're always wrong. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.